Okay, I think we're about at a critical mass. So let me start and welcome everybody. Hi, I'm Ken Stern. I'm the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. Welcome to our webinar today, and I'm delighted to have my Bard Berlin colleague, Aaron Tugendhaft, to discuss hateful images and iconography and his new book, which I'm going to hold up for you to see, which is called The Idols of ISIS. It's a very provocative book, and I encourage you to get a hold of it. It's worth the read. So let me introduce Aaron. He is going to speak for about 25 minutes or so. We'll see, and then we'll take Q&A. And what I will remind you to do later, but I'll tell you now, and you feel free to do it now if you'd like, is to, if you have a question, just put it in the Q&A box. I will be reading them to Aaron, and we'll finish up in an hour. So as I mentioned, Aaron is a scholar of the ancient Middle East and a dedicated humanities teacher focusing on religion, political philosophy, and the arts. He's at Bard Berlin, and he's received his PhD from the Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at New York University in 2012, and also holds degrees in art history and social thought from the University of Chicago. And before coming to Bard College Berlin, he was a Harper Fellow in the Society of Fellows in Liberal Arts at the University of Chicago. In 2013, he received the Jonas Greenfield Prize for Younger Scientists from the American Oriental Society. And his most recent book, The Idols of ISIS from Assyria to the Internet, University of Chicago Press 2020, explores the political power of images and the significance of their destruction. And I know he started working on it before we started seeing the issues this year of the Black Lives Matter protest and the questions about images and destruction. So Aaron, welcome. Share your book and your knowledge with us.
First of all, thank you, Ken, for that lovely introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be here. Just one point of correction, I should say, that the Jonas Greenfield Prize was for younger Semitists, not scientists. I don't want anyone to think I know anything about science, though I do teach the history of science. Anyway, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to have this opportunity to tell you a little bit about my new book. What I plan to do is just to use this time to first give you a little bit of an introduction, how I came about writing this book, and then afterwards I will read a passage from the book, from the end of the book. Hopefully doing so won't make you not want to read the earlier parts of the book, but we'll see. So in February 2015, the Islamic State released a video onto the internet of destruction of ancient sculpture in Iraq's Mosul Museum. And here are just some images from that video. I was at the time visiting a lecture at the NYU's Institute for the Study of the Ancient World that was actually about ancient Near Eastern art. And at the end of the lecture, one of the members of the audience asked, what should we do? How do we deal with what's going on today? And I had actually not yet seen the video. I had not been on Facebook, which is where this was circulating mostly all day. And so I went into a corner of the room and I checked my phone, and there it was, posted repeatedly on my feed, this video of destruction in the Mosul Museum. I want to say one thing about the video to begin with, is that the video is not just a record of acts of destruction. It itself was a finely crafted image in its own right. And so this destruction of images was used as the raw footage for a new image that was sophisticatedly edited with a soundtrack and a whole bunch of things that made the video a compelling image in its own right. And so we're not dealing only here with images, but also images of image destruction. And so not only the hate for images, but also images of that hate. And I think that's an important thing to recognize. Now, immediately or very soon after I saw the video for the first time, I remembered another image that I happened to know. I had actually used it for the cover of a volume, a book that I edited called Idle Anxiety. And it's this image on the right. And the image, it's a drawing of an ancient Assyrian palace relief from the palace of Sargon II at Khorsabad. And this image was made 2,500 years roughly before the image to the left. But if we look at them, first of all, we can see how both images show three men with sledgehammers smashing the sculpture of a king that's lying horizontally on the ground. And I said, right, the Assyrian image was made 2,500 years earlier, but only 25 kilometers away, Khorsabad being just northwest, northeast of Mosul. And so one of the initial questions that got me started on the book was just simply thinking about these two images, their uncanny resemblance one to the other, and the question of why this incessant desire to destroy images, what's behind this impulse to destroy images, and what's behind this this act of making images of image destruction. At the same time, the book has a personal quality for me. My grandfather was born in Baghdad, a member of the Jewish community that had been living in Iraq since the time of the Babylonian exile in antiquity. And he, as a young man, was involved in participating in and shaping the young modern state of Iraq, together with Muslims, Sunni and Shia, Christians, Marxists, other kinds of atheists, and many other kinds of people who were in the process of building the new nation of Iraq. And it was a very cosmopolitan project at the time in Baghdad. And yet my grandfather also lived through the Farhud, the 1941 pogrom against Jews in Baghdad, pictured here on the right, which precipitated his leaving Baghdad, first to Tehran, and then with his family from Tehran to Tel Aviv, and eventually to New York, which is where I was born. And so part of the impetus to work on this project was to think about how a political community moves from being pluralistic to becoming more and more homogenistic, and what the challenges are for maintaining the plurality of and pluralism in a polity. Now, the Jews left early on. This process continued in Iraq. Here I show two images, one from before 2006 and one from after 2006. showing the ethnic areas of Baghdad. And on the left, in the pre-2006 image, you see a lot of yellow. And the yellow designates neighborhoods that were mixed, Sunni and Shia. And on the right, you see how in the wake of the American-led invasion and the violence that ensued afterwards, how that yellow area has shrunk significantly, and that the country is becoming more and more polarized, and neighbors are becoming more and more homogenized. Now, of course, at the time that the ISIS video was released in 2015, ISIS was going on a rampage through northern Iraq, and more and more there was more and more homogenization of the area was underway, either through attacks on Shia or on minority groups like the Yazidis and the Assyrians. And here I just show an example from an article in the Islamic State's video, the Islamic State's magazine, which came in, this article came out around the same time as the video, and this article calls for the extinction of the gray zone, of what ISIS calls the gray zone. And this is their goal, their desire, they say, which is that they want to extinguish the gray zone where there is any ambiguity as to where one stands in terms of one's allegiance, in order to divide the world into an absolutely polarized binary system of those people of faith on the one hand, and those of apostasy on the other. And so to completely divide the world into these two camps and eradicate any of that kind of plurality or pluralism that had existed in Iraq, and that especially with thinkers like Hannah Arendt, which Hannah Arendt would say is that pluralism that's absolutely essential for true politics to exist. And so a kind of escape from politics by moving instead towards this kind of polarization. And so these two things motivated the whole book, thinking about these two issues together. First of all, the question of the hatred of images, their destruction, and the making of images of that destruction on the one hand, and the challenges of pluralism and the challenges of embracing the difficulty of living in a pluralistic political community, or engaging in pluralistic political life. These were the two issues that motivated the book, and that I tried to think about how they interact. What is the relationship between images and plurality? And this is what I explore over 3 chapters. And here are just 3 images to give you a sense of the 3 chapters. The 3 chapters are entitled Idols, Museums, and Videos. And so moving from the left, this is an image of Ibrahim smashing the idols. And the chapter deals extensively with the story in the Quran of Ibrahim smashing the idols, in light of the fact that the spokesperson in the ISIS video declares that this is what they are doing, that they are destroying idols, and that the objects, the statues, are idols that have to be destroyed. And so I explore this claim in the first chapter, making use in particular of the work of the great medieval Islamic philosopher Al-Farabi and his political thought, and what he has to say about the necessity of images for political life. The second chapter, Museums, deals with the question of what was the significance of this video taking place in a museum, and what is the significance of these objects existing in a museum, especially since while ISIS said that they were destroying idols, the international community quickly declared their horror at the video and the horror at the destruction of heritage. Heritage that either belongs to all of humanity or to the Iraqi people, depending on who you asked or at what time of day you asked the same person. And so the second chapter traces the complicated story of the different political meanings that have been attributed to ancient Mesopotamian objects since their rediscovery in the 19th century. And the image here, for example, is an image of the Nineveh room in the British Museum in the 19th century. And then finally on the right, representing the chapter called Videos, is an image of my Facebook feed, where you see one of the ISIS videos, the blowing up the palace at Nimrud, there on my feed. And it's in this chapter that I really get into the question of not the destruction of images, but the making of images of that destruction and the ways that those images are circulated. In antiquity, on the palace walls of Assyrian palaces, and today through social media, and the significance of social media as a means of distributing these images, and how social media has changed the nature of iconoclasm and of the distribution of images, of image destruction. So those are the major components of the book. And now I just would like to read to you from the coda that follows these 3 chapters. In the weeks leading up to his mental collapse in 1889, Friedrich Nietzsche composed Twilight of the Idols, or How to Philosophize with a Hammer. Posing questions with a hammer and perhaps hearing in reply that famous hollow sound, Nietzsche writes, "What a pleasure for me, an old psychologist and Pied Piper. In my presence, the very things that want to keep quiet are made to speak out." Nietzsche neither venerates idols nor smashes them. Instead, he taps them as with a tuning fork. The idols that concern Nietzsche are those of Western philosophy, the oldest, most convinced, puffed up, and fat-headed idols you will ever find. But the figure of the idol tapper suggests an attitude that can be extended to all the images that orient us. As Ibrahim knew, all images are incomplete, but he was too patient to tap them. Hammer in hand, he never gave them a chance to speak. Had Ibrahim grasped that images are coy, not dumb, he might have used his hammer to sound them out instead of destroying them. Had he tapped them lightly, as with a tuning fork, they might have divulged something to Ibrahim and his neighbors about the regime they were living under and its possible alternatives. We will never live in a regime without images, nor find images that aren't the work of human hands. The best we can do is embrace the ongoing task of deciding which imperfect images to live with. In order to evaluate our images, we must discover what they conceal. But how can we make them voice what they, and we, would prefer to keep silent? One way is to tap images against one another, a technique I've used throughout this book. Both the Islamic State's Mosul Museum video from 2015 and the Illustrated London News engraving of the British Museum's Nineveh room from 1853 depict ways of comporting oneself in a museum. As models of behavior embedded within broader social forms, each conceals as well as reveals. The English engraving evokes respectability and sophistication. Seen on its own, it might not call up the imperialism that often attends museum going as a cosmopolitan ideal. Tap it against the ISIS video, however, and hidden aspects of the engraving start to come into view. Of course, that doesn't make the two images equally beneficial for communal life. Judgment may rightly incline us to choose one over the other. But judgment, as opposed to knee-jerk chauvinism, requires that we discern and assess the unsavory unsavory elements of our chosen images and recognize how other images promote goods that ours cannot. Tapping images can make us keener critics of ourselves as well as of others. If all images are incomplete, not all incomplete, if all images are incomplete, not all are incomplete in the same way. Some, like the Mosul Museum video and the Illustrated London News engraving, hide their incompleteness by presenting matters as settled. Other images are overtly incomplete and pose questions more than they provide answers. German photographer Thomas Struth has been making images of visitors at some of the world's finest museums since 1989. By focusing on museum goers, he challenges viewers of his photographs to reflect on the activity of looking at art. Struth's images draw our attention to the reverence, contemplation, and sometimes boredom people experience when visiting museums. The photos should lead viewers away from regarding the works as mere fetish objects and initiate their own understanding, Struth said in an interview. Therein lies the moment of pause or questioning, because the viewers are reflected in their activity. They have to wonder what they themselves are doing at the moment. Pergamon Museum 4 Berlin, for instance, seen here, depicts small groups of lone museum goers in a brightly lit room filled with fragments of ancient Greek sculpture. While the composition recalls the engraving in the Illustrated London News, it doesn't advertise the importance of museum going so much as ask us to consider why we take museum going so seriously. Encountered on a museum wall, Struth's large print, which measures 5 by 7.5 feet, confronts us with an image of people doing what we ourselves are doing, but the activity appears strange. We see that there are museum goers in the picture, but we're not quite sure why they are there. In the Pergamon Museum photographs, Struth intensifies this estrangement by deliberately posing the museum goers. Struth's photograph unsettles what we have taken for granted by introducing ambiguity. His image makes us wonder about ourselves. This wondering of yours is very much the mark of a philosopher, Socrates reportedly told the mathematician Theaetetus. Philosophy starts nowhere else but with wondering. Like Socrates, who provoked people in the agora, images can make us wonder about matters we ordinarily take for granted. Might one build a regime entirely of such wonder-inducing images? The idea may sound appealing, but the never-ending uncertainty such a regime would elicit would make life unbearable. Images that take a stand are necessary. Besides, unsettling images tend over time to become domesticated. It is easy to say that one should always be critical. The practice of self-criticism is more difficult. As Socrates knew, a stimulus that awakens wonder can also trigger rage. Many in the agora were perfectly content with their unexamined opinions and the civic gods that grounded them. They weren't interested in tapping their city's images. Socrates' incessant questions were an unwelcome irritation. Indeed, some say that Socrates was a troll, writes Rachel Barney in her mock Aristotelian treatise on trolling. No wonder his fellow citizens put him to death. When I first saw the Mosul Museum video, I reacted with rage, just as ISIS wanted. Their tyrannical theatrics were intended not to make me reevaluate my opinions, but to entrench me in my prejudices. I was being provoked to smash back. The more outraged, the less free to exercise judgment. On rewatching the video, I recalled the Assyrian relief from Khorsabad. The uncanny resemblance called out for comparison. Curiosity pulled me out from my apolitical stupor and inarticulate rage. Suddenly, the hollowness of my own political images began to tap against the ISIS video and to reverberate. I began to wonder, and that wonder led to this book. Political life vitally depends on shared images that allow us to envision how we want to live together. We will live with images for as long as we remain political beings. To be free citizens, we need to think about how our political images arose, why they were chosen, and what they leave out. In that way, we become aware of our images' incompleteness without denying our need for them or pretending we didn't make them. We don't have to smash them or to submit to them. We can tap them instead.
Great, thank you, Aaron, for that. Thank you for the book. So I see we have a couple of questions, and I encourage people to add more to them. One of them I can handle because it's an easy one. So is it possible to get a link to this video? I will send to everybody who is registered a copy of the video tomorrow, and please feel free to share that with anybody you'd like. So another question is, I'd like to hear a little more about why Hannah Arendt said polarization and, quote, true politics cannot mix. Some context as well.
Great. So thank you for the question. So Hannah Arendt, and this is in a sense following Aristotle, argues that political life requires plurality. That the very point of politics is to bring together human beings who are naturally distinct from one another in such a way that they can live together, but without violence, or at least that's the ideal, is that politics is a tool that can allow us to live together in our plurality without violence, or an alternative to violence. And so Aristotle says that that he uses a musical metaphor, and that what we want is a harmony between the different notes that are the different people that make up a political community. He says that if everybody was reduced to being homogenous, what we would have would be simply a single note being played, not harmony. But on the other hand, they do need to be brought together in a way, and this is the work that in my book I talk about. This is the work that images can do, because if they aren't brought together, what you would have is a cacophony. And so politics is that way of trying to find that space, that way between homogeneity, or the single note, or cacophony, or anarchy, or just pure individuation, without the possibility of community on the other hand. And so it's that vision of politics that I find really important to think about, and very important to think about. Well, to think about precisely because it requires some work, in the sense that we have a tendency, I believe, to try to escape politics. And so one of the main themes of the book is this: how iconoclasm belongs to a deeper impulse among human beings to try to escape politics, because it's difficult to do the work of keeping a plurality together, and escape politics into more homogenized units, whether that's in the form of polarization, or as I discuss in the final sections of the book, when I talk about Facebook, the kinds of echo chambers that result with social media, and the algorithms that are meant precisely to constantly produce a world for us that is individuated, such that we start to inhabit, to the extent that our world becomes more and more the world that we inhabit online. It becomes a world that the algorithms decide to give us each our own world rather than a shared world. And it's precisely the shared world that's necessary for politics to take place. And for Arendt, that also means it's precisely the space where freedom, political freedom, can be achieved, and that's one of the highest things that a human being can achieve. And so my book, in a lot of ways, is an attempt to think about what's necessary to allow us to achieve that kind of political freedom, and what are the challenges and what are the impulses that make us try to flee from it.
Great, thank you, Aaron. I'm going to ask you a very simple question, then we have a bunch more complex ones. So the simple question, is it possible to get a copy of the ISIS video showing from the museum?
So I believe I should have a copy of it in my hard drive, and I could get it, and I can get it to you. There are plenty of clips online, though the full videos, ISIS videos, have generally been taken down for obvious reasons. This is also why YouTube has banned me from YouTube, because I started doing this research a number of years ago, and I've told them that I'm writing a book, and they told me they don't care. And so I continue to be banned from YouTube. But I believe I do have a recording on my hard drive, which I can make available to you.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to pop in with a question of my own that reading your book made me think about. So, we tend to see the world as us and a them, and, the issues that you write about show that at its extreme. But I wonder, we tend to look at symbols too, not just images. So, the power of the flag, the American flag, and people want to, to make it illegal to burn it, or the Nazi flag and the power that was to get people inspired to hate, or, ideas, the Second Amendment as a symbol. So how do you see a difference between the power of symbols and a power of images, or do you see them somehow tapping into the same instinct?
Right. No, it's a great question. And so I've mainly been thinking more about love than hate. And so this would be interesting to sort of put this now in the two obviously go hand in hand in many ways. And so I think that this could be a productive line of thinking. So I should say that when I talk about images, I actually am talking about something incredibly broad, and sometimes some might say really so broad that it becomes meaningless. I don't think it becomes meaningless, but I want to share, maybe let me first share a little bit about what I have in mind when I'm using the term images, what I'm having it stand in for, because I think it includes the symbols that you're talking about, Ken, but is also broader than that. And this is really fully developed in the first chapter, and I use Al-Farabi to develop it, though one can also find versions of this argument in Plato, who influenced Al-Farabi. And the argument goes basically something like this. Any political community needs laws. And that not only laws, it needs people to obey those laws and to follow those laws. But the laws themselves are not lovable. The types of commitments that we have to the law doesn't generate on its own, but rather we need something else to generate that love for the community, to make us want to be part of that community. And basically what I'm talking about images, or if we want, we can be more specific. When I'm talking about political images, I'm talking about images that do that political work of making us care about the community that we belong to, and make us want to follow the laws that hold that community together. And that means the images of our highest aspirations, what we take to be glorious or just or valuable, and likewise the opposite, what we want to shun, what we want to stay away from. And that these are the things that produce the particularity of any political community, and gives the political community a kind of robustness, and because the law itself won't produce that. It's too abstract, and it's too abstract. And on the other hand, right, the other thing images are different from is some kind of absolute truth or scientific truth that may be accessible, perhaps to some people, but is incredibly abstract, that a political community can't rely on that either. You can't have a political community that's just rooted in the truth of nature, but rather every political community needs to create some kind of mediator between whatever the true or the good it might be in some type of philosophical sense, and that which is actually compelling to all of the members of that community. And so we can think of these as moving images, right? Not just videos or film, right, as moving images in the sense that the images are moving, but images that move us, right? That make us be moved to care about the communities that we live in. And so hopefully that's helpful in trying to get a sense of how I'm using the term, which is, I understand, more expansive maybe than one might originally think one means when one uses the word image. So maybe, Ken, if you can restate the question on the basis of that, so we can get, because that was really just preamble.
No, no, I thought that was,
Sorry about that.
I thought that was very, very instructive and helpful. So let me get to some of the other questions. Then, if you want to loop back in more to that's it.
Okay, I didn't mean to avoid the question.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So here's one that I'm interested very much in too. And can you speak to the issue of Confederate statue leaders? What do you think about those and the controversy over them?
Right. So the answer that I would want to give is not is about how to engage with the problem and the question. And what I'm hoping that the book does, right, is that it provides a more robust and constructive way about thinking about images and the role of images politically than we might have otherwise. And in that sense, right, the book is by no means just a book about ISIS or about the Islamic State. And so I do want it to be relevant to questions like the question of Confederate statues. And so I would say that that last line that I read from, those last lines that I read from the Coda, I think speak to this directly, right? That to be free citizens, we need to think about how our political images arose, why they were chosen, and what they leave out, right? In that way, we can become aware of our images' incompleteness without denying our need for them or pretending we didn't make them. And so I think from that perspective, their Confederate statues leave a lot to be desired in terms of the political work that they're doing. I think that they are also not directing us towards, here I'm speaking as an American, if we think about what the highest goals of America are, they're not directing us towards those goals. And so in a sense, they're political images, but they're political images that are at odds with our highest selves as Americans. And so they're doing counterproductive work on the one hand, right? And so I think that one can make certainly judgment saying that those are not the images that one would want for the kind of polity that we aspire to be. On the other hand, I want to be clear that, and in this case, I don't really think this is so much a problem in the American case, or at least it's not as emphatically a problem as it is as presented in the ISIS case. But there's an element of it, and the problem is this: that one should not, in tearing down those statues, think that one can either that live without images or replace them with images that are perfectly true and perfectly just. Right. So one of the things that I want to avoid is a discourse where we think that we are eradicating injustice and replacing it with justice, pure and pure. And that it's the very nature of images is such that they always are partial. They only tell a story, and they can aim at some good, but that means that there are some other goods that other images could be aiming at, that the ones that we've chosen are not, right? And they're always leaving something out. And I think that that's really essential in order for the discussion around Confederate images in the United States to be a political discussion, right? So that for it to be a discussion about how we want to do better as a polity, but still as a polity, still politically, still realizing that what we're not doing is some kind of purely moral act that thinks in a Manichaean good versus bad, replacing bad with good. That's not politics, and so if we think about the eradication of Confederate statues in that way, I think that we're not going to be we're on the wrong foot when trying to remain political.
Let me push you on that a little bit more, because I mean, it's one of the issues that I had to think about too. And one of the things I always contemplate when I'm looking at an issue that intersects hatred is to play around with the scenario and see if I would feel differently. So for me, is that, a Jewish person, it's a question of what would I think about a statue of Hitler that was put up in a place at a time where there was a political moment that people found that inspiring, just like the Confederate statues were not put up during the Civil War, they were put up during Jim Crow for a political reason. So I could understand, as a Black person, having to pass that at a town square or something of General Lee, why that would be deeply disturbing. In the same way, I would find a Hitler statue, put up in a similar type of way disturbing. Yet, I really worry about the idea of then just sort of removing the images, because then you remove the history of why that was put up at the time and the place. So as disturbing as I would find walking by a Hitler statue someplace, there's a strong part of me that would say, it's important to preserve it and contextualize it as a symbol of what happened when people let that type of image reflect their politics at a later period.
So I have that's one way that one could tap. I mean, in a sense, this image that I'm trying to borrow from Nietzsche of tapping rather than being either submitting to or destroying, right? And so what you're talking about, recontextualizing or these types of things, this would be a way of making the image reveal what it otherwise wants to keep hidden, right? It's when the image itself doesn't want to reveal the fact that it was put up during Jim Crow to intimidate Blacks. That's not part of what the image itself, right? The grandiose, very noble looking Robert E. Lee on a horse, that's not what the image itself is, in a way speaking, but that's what the image can be made to speak by treating it in that way. And so I agree with you that these are certainly this is certainly a way that one can engage with those images. Yeah.
Okay, so here's another question. Actually, two questions or two parts of a question, but I'm going to put in a larger context. The question is, but what should be done with sociopaths? Let them speak and rouse people, lock them up, share their ideas with people in a calm and reflective manner, along with the ideas of other people. And then she said, I'm not casually mentioning sociopaths. I'm thinking about Hitler and others, Stalin, Mussolini, and Charles Manson. And I guess the question that raises for me is, are you saying that these types of relationships with symbols and idols and images and so forth is something that's a reflective of a, like what a sociopath would do? Or is it just part of our human condition of how we look at these images? And then you have extremes of people who carry them out to the logical endpoint of their ideology or theology, but it's not, a reflection of being a sociopath. It's a reflection of being too human in some ways.
Right. So first, I don't know the proper definition of a sociopath, and I'm not sure if I would even trust science to tell me what a sociopath is. So I don't know if I want to go into that. The term sociopath suggests that there's a scientific way to know who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak. And I suppose I am a little bit wary of that kind of move, the move that says that we can shift over to a kind of scientific expertise so that we don't actually have to engage with another person with respect in a political way, through discussion and attempts at persuasion. At the margins, are there people who are simply not competent to participate in political life, just as that we wouldn't say that children, right, under a certain age are capable of participating in political life? Certainly. And I think that, so we'd have to think, that's a difficult question of how you define that. But what I'm trying to point attention just to the other side of the question, which is our tendency to try and circumvent the difficult work of engaging politically by means of a number of different types of moves. So whether it's a move of, well, let's let expert science determine who gets to be right? So, for example, one of the things I talk about a lot in the book in the second chapter is the dichotomy between civilization and barbarism, which was scientifically grounded according to 19th century science, right? That we knew what human beings actually count as human beings and what human beings don't, because they belong to a kind of subgroup called of barbarism. And it was precisely that distinction between civilized and barbaric that one saw in the discourse around ISIS in February 2015, saying, well, clearly the barbarians are at it again and we need to go save civilization from them. And the symbolism of Mesopotamia and the cradle of civilization, so-called, plays into this a lot as well. So I don't have a definitive answer to that, but I do think that we need to be very careful when we're seeking these ways around the hard work of politics, whether it's by means of science, whether it's by means of certain statements of, any of these things with capital letter science or history or the market. Is very convenient to something that you can say, well, the market will determine it, so we don't actually have to engage in the hard work of judgment and and persuasion. And then finally, something that I deal with a lot in the book, right, is the algorithm. How the algorithm is not that algorithms are new, but now with digital technology, the algorithm is the new way that we can avoid being political by letting things get decided, so supposedly by the algorithm. But of course, the algorithm is also determined, right, programmed first by human beings. So these are the types of questions that I try to tackle in the book.
Thank you. So related to that is this question. It seems to me that nobody in this world lives up to ideal standards. Is it possible to put anyone, quote, on a pedestal or make any person into a monument without risking that some group of people will find fault and perhaps see the need to topple that image? And so, how do you reach consensus at a moment about somebody worthy of being memorialized that way, or a monument being put up. And then I guess the related question to that is, if you continue to have the politics and that agreement at one point then breaks down, how do you navigate that?
So I think it's a great question. I think that the key is just to be more honest with ourselves about what human beings are. So I think the minute that you idealize someone to that extent, right, nobody is ever going to live up to that. And so then the person can always, and if that's the necessity, right, and if that's required in order to not be toppled, then everything will be toppled. But that will leave us in a position, I try to argue, where we're certainly no better off, because we're not actually capable. We won't be able to live together as a community, and that's essential for our happiness. And here I'm just quoting Al-Farabi. And I think to connect this to Ibrahim, that in the story of the Quran, Ibrahim doesn't think that any of the statues actually succeed as embodying the divine, right? And so none of them live up to his standard, and so all of them have to be destroyed, and rather God has to be worshipped or served politically without mediation. But of course, that leaves him no better off, actually far worse off. And so I suppose that the best thing that we can do in those situations is just to become much more honest with ourselves about what we expect from human beings.
Great, thank you. One more related question about the statues. Do you think that the answer to this is to put statues that people find disturbing in contemporary times, into museums? What's the upside or downside of that, especially since you start your book in a museum?
Yeah, so I don't. First of all, I mean, this is a larger question, but I'm not entirely convinced that find disturbing is the criterion that one should necessarily go by. Sometimes it's, but this is a complicated issue. Whether they should be removed and put into museums, these are political questions. And if the communities come together and and decide that through negotiation and through discussion, that they decide that the best way to be the polity that they want to be is to do that. I mean, that's a political question that I don't have an expertise on. Certainly, I can say about museums that all museums are going to come with a narrative, right? And so maybe in this case, the whole purpose is to provide that narrative, right? To give a particular narrative to those images. That doesn't mean, of course, that the narrative that the museum gives is going to be the definitive one, right? Or is going to bar the possibility of alternative narratives being provided for the same images. And so there's always going to be that contestation, and that's part of what would be involved there. So yeah, that's
okay. So I have one more question I wanted to ask
yeah.
too. Is there a flip side to something? Your book's very powerful, and you talk about how images can be used to take out the gray zone, to make it, black and white, us and them. There's something noble, I presume, that the ISIS folks thought they were doing something, pleasing God as they were destroying, this history. So there's that whole, aspect of how the images work into our perception of us and the other. Are there ways for images to be used to tap into the opposite, the universal impulse, as opposed to the tribal one? And just to give you, an example from a different medium, and I think I've mentioned this before in a different webinar, but one of the things I decided to do a few years ago was to find some more alternative sources of news. So sought out Fox News and other things. And then I found this channel on DirecTV, which I don't know if you get in Berlin, but we get it here. That's, channel 200. And what it allows you in 4 different boxes, you see MSNBC, CNN, BBC, and Fox News, and for a while they had Newsmax on it. So this was, to me, an image of simultaneously alternative realities, and you can flip from one to the other to get the different, perceptions. So are there ways that people have used this impulse for images to try to show people that politics is more complex as opposed to just, I'm right, they're wrong?
I mean, absolutely. So I think what I try to do in the book by bringing different images together that one might not normally see together, and then let them open, each one opens up the other, is in a sense, as far as I understand, similar to what you're saying about the different channels, and allowing them to open up each other, right? Each of them is partial when taken on its own, but if you actually do the work of looking at them together and thinking about them, then one can arrive at a more honest and a more penetrating understanding of our aspirations and our limitations. I think the again, just to reiterate this point about social media and algorithms, I think the big problem with social media and the fact that more and more of us are getting our world from social media and not from cable television, where you can flip from channel to channel, is that you can't flip from channel to channel on your Facebook feed, and that your Facebook feed presents itself as if it were the entire world, but it's actually just created for you. And the more you tell it what you want and what you are, the more it will give you what you want and embed you in who you are. And so I think that we really need to be very careful about that. And I don't think, actually, this is just the last point. There have been recent discussions about social media. Just last week, the Senate Judiciary Committee, brought Dorsey from Twitter and Zuckerberg from Facebook and questioned them. It's a 4-hour thing, I think I remember. And it's actually, I found it very, very problematic that nearly none of the senators had any understanding of the role that the algorithms are playing, and that they were treating these social media platforms as if they were just modern versions of newspapers or television, and as if they distributed information in the same way, except for the fact that they don't distribute information in the same way. And so in that sense, when it comes to thinking about the problems of politics, of images politically today, frankly, I think that actually we need to think much more about the images that we see repeatedly on our feeds than we were talking about before, the statues in the park. I'm not saying that the statues in the park isn't a problem with it, but in a lot of ways, the statues in the park problem is being used as a way to generate images that then go on social media and polarize people one way or the other through the images that are generated from those statues in the park. And I think that it's very important to redirect the conversation in that direction, just because I think that it has a lot more of an impact on our politics at the moment.
Great. Aaron, on that last point too, I don't mean to end on a depressing note, but somebody sent me an interesting study a couple of weeks ago where some people were basically given some money to go on to have an algorithm that would send them things from the opposite political bucket.
Right.
And so they knew they were getting paid for it. They would look at some of these things and they analyze it later, rather than giving them there's some reasonable people. I might disagree with what their views are and what their symbols are. It made them more entrenched in their own vilification of the other side. So it's a lot to work on there, but I appreciate I think your book is a contribution for what we'd all like to see. I want to thank you very much for spending an hour with us. I want to thank everybody who attended, and wishing everybody a great holiday season. And we'll see you again in January. We're going to do
a great Hanukkah gift or Christmas present. It fits.
This is true. This is true.
It's purposely made to fit inside of a stocking.
Yeah, just, you know, it wouldn't be great for a 3-year-old, but other than that, it's fine.
What says Christmas better than ISIS? You know.
There you go. There you go. On that happy note, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you. Bye-bye.